We often hear how people are leaving the church, which is why I get so excited when I think about how as a church we're doing things like Upper Room. I'm excited about tools like Alpha and Discovery, and it feels like there's this growing momentum of people wanting to share Jesus with others. And in those conversations, the term missionary discipleship has started to show up all over the place in the church. The missionary part makes sense to me, especially as we sit here as part of Proclaim. But today, I want to take a step back and talk about why the discipleship part of missionary discipleship is so important and why fully committing to having a group of disciples who walk with you can radically change how you impact the people around you. See, just like a child needs time to mature into who they are, we also need time to mature as missionary disciples. Being evangelized marks the beginning of our journey, and discipleship is our maturing. It's the journey of learning, growing, changing, and becoming more like Jesus. We need discipleship to become more effective as missionary disciples. Being in discipleship is actually the secret sauce in evangelization. Sometimes the way it's talked about is that we do evangelization over here and discipleship over there. But I actually believe that when we do discipleship well, it becomes the heart of sharing Jesus with others, because it makes Jesus real to us in the everyday. So what is discipleship? Discipleship is the process of becoming more like Jesus, becoming more free, transforming our hearts to love well, learning to hear the voice of the Father, being filled with the Holy Spirit, and walking in step with Him. Discipleship is learning how to live from our true identity as sons and daughters of God. A discipleship group could look different for different people, but it's the collection of people in your life who are committed to walking with you in your faith journey. For me, it's my wife, my men's group, my business partners, spiritual mentors and father figures, and individual brothers and sisters who know me and trust me to speak into my life and allow me to speak into theirs. Embracing discipleship has always been at the center of our faith because it's learning how to live more like Jesus. But I believe it's becoming even more important right now if we want the gospel to be seen as relevant in our culture. So today, we're going to talk about discipleship and cover 3 questions. How has the world changed, and how does that impact evangelization? How do we become more potent in sharing the gospel in light of the culture? And what makes a great discipleship group? So let's start with what's going on in our cultural moment right now. Have you ever been in a conversation where you realize you just don't see the world the same as someone else? I mean, of course you have. You lived through 2020. But I had one of these conversations that really surprised me about 5 years ago that make me wonder what was going on. See, I've always enjoyed talking to young people about their faith. And I was having a conversation with a young woman who was around 20, and she had grown up in the church. And the part that struck me was that she said, "Why does the church make such a big deal about sex before marriage?" And don't get me wrong, I had all the answers. Theology of the body, love and responsibility. The church has defined that it's a sin. Sex has consequences emotionally as well as physically. It leads to babies. Are you ready to have babies? But as I started sharing, I saw in her eyes that none of my answers were addressing what was going on in her heart. And I feel like I've had variations of that conversation over and over again. And it wasn't that I was in apologetics mode or just being tone deaf to the situation. My heart was fully present to the situation. And these were people that I knew and that they knew that I cared about them. But there was something about these conversations that made me wonder why my words weren't resonating with them. And I didn't fully grasp what was going on until I read this passage in Henry Nouwen's book, Wounded Healer. And he talks about this modern person that is defined by being rootless and fatherless. He says in his book, "This fearful generation which rejects its fathers and quite often rejects the legitimacy of every person or institution that claims authority is facing a new danger, becoming captive to itself. Instead of the father, the peer becomes the standard. But the tyranny of the fathers is not the same as the tyranny of one's peers. Not following fathers is quite different from not living up to the expectations of one's peers. The first means disobedience, and the second, nonconformity. The first creates guilt feelings, the second, feelings of shame. In this respect, there's an obvious shift from a guilt culture to a shame culture. That's what was happening to me in my conversations. I was operating from a perspective that we still lived in a guilt culture. And just to be clear, I wasn't trying to guilt people into knowing Jesus. I was operating under the assumption that we all thought the rules were important and that they were there for a good reason, that there was a loving reason why they were there, that there was wisdom behind them, and even though we've seen scandal in our day, that there's still wisdom that the church offers, that the institutions do a lot of good, even though sometimes leaders and people who run them don't. What I was realizing in my conversations was that people didn't feel guilt anymore for rejecting the rules. There was not this shared understanding that we had on how to live our lives. Instead, they're living in the dynamics of a new shame culture. They aren't asking the same questions. They're not saying, how do I live by the rules in order to find happiness? They're asking, how can I measure up in order to belong? Young people are especially hesitant to any form of authority dictating how they live their lives. But I think this sentiment goes far beyond just young people anymore and into the broader reaches of our culture. So what does this all mean? What does Henry Nouwen and the reality of a shame culture mean for evangelization? When we don't have our cultural identities formed from a rooted fathering perspective, or we drift away from this, we are forced to find it by being validated by our peers. I see it in how social media has exploded because people are desperate to be liked. It's about being able to fit in, to be seen as measuring up, presenting a perfect version of themselves and ourselves in order to be validated. We're all made to receive an identity, but the world we live in is making people earn it. When a culture rejects authority, no one can be trusted to define what brings life meaning. So everyone is forced into defining their own meaning in order for them to create their own happiness. Which is why the term "you do you" is the new norm in our culture. Why do you think that if you have anything to say against someone's self-defined path to happiness, you're labeled as a bigot or insensitive, or even as preaching hate speech? This is an exhausting way to live. I bet we can all think of people in our lives who are stuck in this, whether that's our friends, our family members, or our kids. They're striving to find identity in work, romantic relationships, partying, hobbies, social media, and anything else that gives them a moment of relief from how they feel inside. I'm not highlighting these things to be depressing. I actually think there's a lot of hope even within this cultural reality, and it's in the power of discipleship. See, even if we don't experience guilt when we sin, it still has an effect on us because that's how we've been designed. Sin is not life-giving. When we struggle to say, I did something wrong, and instead have feelings that something is wrong with me, we move from experiencing guilt to experiencing shame. And when our lifestyle creates feelings of shame, we look for people living the same lifestyle because it's the fastest way to try to deal with the shame, is to find acceptance. But acceptance comes at the cost of identity. And quickly, my lifestyle can become my identity. And anyone who threatens my lifestyle becomes my enemy. But the good news is that we already have the answer to breaking through the fog that is hovering over us. And it's in belonging. It's not to try and pull the splinter out of my brother's eye first, or to give them a theological correction, which, if I'm honest, I've attempted to do myself many times. But instead, it's about being able to accept someone wholeheartedly without having to address their belief or their behavior first. The model of evangelization for our time is still belong, believe, behave, in that order. I think of the story of Zacchaeus, the short tax collector who was ostracized from his culture for working for the Romans against his people. But Jesus invited him to host him for dinner, to eat together with him in his home. a sign of total acceptance. And over dinner, Zacchaeus encounters the love of God and comes to a transforming faith in Jesus. And then Zacchaeus says, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." He totally changes his behavior. And it's not that Jesus tolerates the sin in their lives. He just doesn't lead with it until they've encountered him. And I also think of the famous encounter of the woman at the well, a Samaritan woman coming to Jacob's well in the middle of the day to avoid the shame of life of sin, not drawing water in the cool of the morning with the other woman. Jesus shows her she belongs with him by asking her for a drink of water. And she comes to encounter him as the Messiah and runs to tell everyone about him. Belong, believe, behave. Look, I'm not saying there isn't room for intellectual or philosophical discussions in the work of evangelization. Of course there is. But the overall momentum is only going to continue if we create a space for people to first find belonging. Because when we lead with anything that feels like an ideological approach or a mandate of change, it's easy to reject and ignore. But when we come with relationships that are filled with acceptance of the person, it's much, much, much harder to brush aside. So how will being in a discipleship group make you more potent in sharing the gospel, especially in the culture that we're living in? How will it help you live the belong first approach more fruitfully? Here's 3 reasons I believe why. 1, our capacity for deep relationships matter for evangelization. 2, it helps us untangle our false identities so we can help others to do the same. And 3, we need belonging and acceptance for ourselves in order to invite others into it. Okay, number 1, our capacity for deep relationships matters for evangelization. What makes our lives truly compelling is our ability to have meaningful relationships. I'm often inspired and moved by relationships that are deep and intimate. Husbands who love their wives well. Friends who share a bond of being present to each other's joys and struggles. What moved me into starting a men's group over 15 years ago was a conversation I had with a mentor named Glenn. At the time, his wife was dying of cancer, and he said, "I don't know what I would do if I didn't have Bob in my life." And Glenn would wake up at 2 a.m. from anxiety and call Bob, and they would go on walks and talk in the middle of the night. And as they walked, Bob was carrying the weight with Glenn and reminding him of who God is when Glenn needed it the most. They were walking discipleship together. Beyond my wife, I knew that I didn't have that kind of relationship in my life with anyone else, the kind that strengthened my faith in times of need. And so on the drive home after that conversation, I called a couple of guys and invited them to start a journey of becoming 2 a.m. friends with me. Over the past 15 years, I've learned a new capacity that changed how I relate to everyone in my life, especially those who haven't encountered Jesus yet. This is not a new idea. Jesus had Peter, James, and John as his inner circle. And then he had 12 apostles that he spent all of his time with. And then he also sent out a group of 70 disciples who went out 2 by 2. Discipleship, by its definition, is trying to emulate the life of Jesus. The nature of evangelization is that we're in relationship with other disciples. Being in relationship matters. That what makes someone truly attractive is their capacity to love others well. Okay, number 2, discipleship groups help us untangle our false identities so that we can help others do the same. Who is the Jesus you want to share with the world? Are you compelled to introduce people to him? And when you think about him, do you feel that he is good? I was asked similar questions on a retreat almost 20 years ago, and I couldn't answer them. I was young and I was on fire for God. I was a youth minister helping on a retreat, and during reconciliation, the priest asked me why I wanted to share Jesus with others. I knew that there was something deep down, but it took me years of processing and working through it with a group of people that surrounded my life to start to see what God was doing in my life. And that's what led me to a deeper understanding that I am a son of the Father. I'm a child of God, and that I belong to Him. It was then that I was able to see how good He really was in my life, and that's what helped me share my faith with way more confidence. As human beings, we have put God's heart on trial since Adam and Eve were in the garden. We have unanswered questions that dictate how we live our lives. Can I trust Him? Does He see me? Has He forgotten me? Am I worth it? Does He have my best intentions at heart? When these questions haven't been answered in our own hearts, it's almost impossible to share our faith with others. And these are the questions that every person asks in one way or another, especially in our culture today. You and I ask these questions. And the power of having a group of disciples around you is that the collective experience of the Father's character is available to everyone. We can gain perspective from each other in how our life story is unfolding. We can gain insight into what Jesus is doing in our lives and clarity of how the Holy Spirit is working through us. We get a bigger, fuller version of who God is because we don't have to rely only on our own perspective. It all boils down to this. When we're walking in discipleship with others, our ability to share who God really is becomes easier. Point number 3. We need belonging and acceptance ourselves in order to invite others into it. So earlier this year, I noticed people posting their word of the year, which is an exercise where you ask the Holy Spirit for a theme for the year to give you more direction. I guess it's sort of like a Catholic version of a New Year's resolution. And scrolling online, I saw someone post a link of a word of the year generator on some popular Catholic blog. And if I'm honest, I was like, that's not how the Holy Spirit works. And I asked God the Father, should I do this whole word of the year thing? And without hesitation, I hear kindness. And I was like, of course, if I was kinder to people, I would be more of a spiritual force. And then fast forward a couple of weeks of me trying to be kinder to everyone, I find myself feeling really stuck in my prayer life. So I decide I'm just gonna listen to some worship songs. And I kid you not, I'm still not sure how this song kind of came on and was in my playlist. But as I was listening, I put this song, and the song came up, and the chorus was, be kind to yourself. My default, and maybe yours is too, is to feel like I have to earn something instead of receiving it freely. I interpreted the word kindness to be for others instead of myself. We all struggle to accept ourselves. Am I good enough? At being a Christian, at being a spouse, a parent, a friend? Am I lovable? We all live in the same culture that we're trying to evangelize. We need the same cure as those we are trying to reach, to be loved by God and by our neighbor. We need a space where belonging is unconditional. Until you know that you belong, you can't extend that to others. Belonging gives us a freedom and security. And when you're living out of that, that's what draws other people in. We've covered a bunch of stuff. Our capacity for deep relationships matter for evangelization, discovering our true identities help others to do the same, and that we need belonging and acceptance for ourselves in order to invite others into it. So what are some practical principles to know whether the group of disciples you are walking with is set up to help you evangelize more? I have 7 topics or groups of questions, and they aren't exhaustive, but they're meant to help keep you aligned to what a discipleship group should look like. If you can't answer any of these questions, that's okay. But asking yourself and your group why you can't answer the questions will help you move deeper into walking with God together. So here we go. Number 1, are you able to share your heart? Are you holding back certain areas that you're scared to go to? Are you going deep? Are you able to be vulnerable with others? And are you willing to get into the hard stuff, your insecurities, your wounds, marriage struggles, financial struggles? 2, is the face of Jesus becoming more clear in your life? Are you able to see him in others? 3, are you able to see where God is moving in your life? Are you able to share stories of what He's up to? 4, are you hearing God's voice in your life? Are others confirming what you're hearing? And are you able to spend time in silence and solitude with Him? 5, is your discipleship group leading to more freedom? Are you giving up comfortable things to move into more freedom? 6, is your trust growing in God? How is that reflected in your life? Are you living a life of surrender? And lastly, 7, is your heart for people growing? Is your desire to share Jesus increasing? Are specific people coming to mind that Jesus wants you to reach out to? These questions are something we should return to often to make sure that our discipleship is in tune with our evangelization. And I hope as part of Upper Room, we can embrace the life of missionary discipleship, doing life alongside other disciples in order for us to encounter the power of the gospel more deeply ourselves, in order to share it with others. Thank you.